This is Donald Trump echoing basically what Turkey is threatening. Turkey is saying, if you even use the rhetoric of occupation, which this 1,000% is, if you as the Europeans use this rhetoric, we will open up, we will basically turn over 3 million Syrian refugees into Europe. Now, the story behind this is a partnership. The Europeans cut a deal with Turkey to absorb about 3.6 million Syrian refugees fleeing the Syrian civil war. Now, in Turkey, number one, they're living in mostly very bad conditions. And but they've also, you know, as communities do, they've proliferated across Turkey and Istanbul and so on. So there's a political volatility to it, and there is a rising xenophobic sentiment towards Syrians in Turkey as well. This is a very classical European move, right? Like, let's instigate something, have an incoherent but hawkish policy, then sort of discurse humanitarian concerns, and then hopefully outsource the problem somewhere else. Now, the migration situation overall in Europe is different and in some ways more complicated. I think that would be foolish to not acknowledge that. However, there's a whole set of deals like this. And even if you look at the work with Omar al-Bashir, the former Sudanese leader who was wanted internationally for war crimes, goes from being a pariah of the sort of do-gooder international community, and rightfully so, to somebody that is being worked with closely to terrorize African migrants and keep migration flows from moving from Africa through the Mediterranean. So Erdogan is basically saying, if you even use rhetoric I don't like about the slaughter that I'm commencing in northern Syria, in the Kurdish areas, and again, there's nothing, I mean, it's happening right in front of your face. And in 2018, the same thing happened in Afrin, except it was the Russians that sold out the Kurds instead of the Americans. Now, Afrin, the Kurds gave up on more quickly because it was more geographically isolated, and they chose to withdraw. But they went in, they slaughtered civilians, they brought people out of their homes, and the idea was, frankly, to re-engineer the population so it wasn't a Kurdish-dominated city. And they cut a deal with the Russians, who had been partnering with the Kurds in that area. The Russians sold the Kurds out, and now Donald Trump and the Americans sell the Kurds out. This is Donald Trump echoing, in his own way, some of the same talking points that Erdogan has, except this is specifically with regards to ISIS captives.
Steve?
These ISIS fighters escape and pose a threat elsewhere.
Well, they're going to be escaping to Europe. That's where they want to go. They want to go back to their homes, but Europe didn't want them from us. We could have given it to them. They could have had trials. They could have done whatever they wanted. But as usual, it's not reciprocal. You know my favorite word, reciprocal. That's all I want. I don't want an edge. I just want reciprocal. And it's not reciprocal, Steve. It's not a fair deal for the United States. And when President Obama took the PKK, you know, when they bring in PKK, that's a tough deal because that's been a mortal enemy of Turkey. So when you bring them into a partnership, it's a tough situation because it's tough for Turkey. It's probably tough for them. They've hated each other for many, many years, for hundreds of years. I mean, it's amazing when you look at history and you look at culture, but you look at the length of the time and the fighting for so long.
It's always clear who this fucking moron's been talking on the phone with.
Yeah, and that thing about they've been fighting these battles for millennium, that is vintage Iraq War, like minimize the Iraq War.
That's
pablum.
it. Well, that's the, oh man, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is just intractable.
It's nobody's fault. It's just their history.
It's just history. They're just living in history, man. oh, the Israelis just bombed a UN school. I mean, well, that's
been going on for 2,000
it's been
years.
going on for I remember, yeah, 2,000 years ago, the Muslims bombed a UN school. So, look, again, let's just do a little bit of primer. The Kurds are systemically oppressed in Turkey. They have been historically. In fact, there was actually some real reforms with both negotiating with the PKK and introducing some basic cultural autonomy and rights for the Kurds in the first Erdogan administrations. That abruptly started to shift in 2015 because of another piece of the story here. The HDP, which is a social democratic party which advocates not only for Kurdish rights, but also really for social democracy and labor and feminism and ecology in Turkey, they performed very well in elections. Since then, their leaders have been made political prisoners by the Erdogan regime, and they've been criminalized as a party. And there is no meaningful opposition to this because the other, the traditional Turkish parties, Erdogan is not a traditional Turkish leader. He came from the emergent Muslim wing, which was violently opposed by the Turkish secular Ataturk tradition. But the Ataturk tradition does not has even more deplorable policies towards the Kurds. In fact, it was reported today that every single former living prime minister has called up, or president, prime minister, Erdogan, I believe, is the president now. He had served as prime minister. That there's been some sort of rejiggering of roles to expand his power. But former Turkish leaders have called him and affirmed their support for these operations. There is a uniformity of nationalism and brutality to the Kurds in Turkish politics. Again, has the PKK, going back in decades of struggle, engaged in what we could call terrorism? And I'll say really specifically, terrorism, in my view, is a targeting of civilian targets, period. And we have to say that is wrong. Just as, we have to say that is wrong, by the way, period. And that, of course, implicates the United States as a major global war criminal. It certainly implicates Israel. It certainly implicates Turkey. It certainly implicates India. Probably not a single major nation state. And groups of people resisting have an absolute right, even under international law, if they're dealing with a foreign occupier, which I guess in the PKK's case it would not be. But they certainly have a moral legitimacy in fighting occupying armies and engaging militarily and guerrilla and subversion that way. I have no problem with that whatsoever. And I think if you're sitting in somewhere like the United States and you're passing judgment on that, I think that's delusional and ridiculous. Targeting specifically of civilians absolutely needs to be condemned categorically, no matter who's doing it, and the PKK has done that at certain times. However, their broader claim is correct. The Kurds are oppressed, period. And also, the PKK and the SDF are not precisely the same thing. There is overlap. There is shared directional leadership from Öcalan, who, by the way, is in prison. So there is some operational constraints on the supposed uniformity of this coalition here. Öcalan is in jail. He is in a Turkish prison. In fact, oddly enough, he was allowed to release a letter by Erdogan a couple of months ago before the mayoral elections in Istanbul. But he is not operationally in control. He has let his followers know that his intellectual, his political ideology has shifted radically because he read a Brooklyn-born, Vermont-living anarchist named Murray Bookchin. And one of the and that has significantly changed the experiment in Rojava. And we can absorb. By the way, I don't understand when people, this whole language of perfection is crazy to me. Yes, literally nobody is. First of all, no thing is perfect. I guess, unless we're talking about Platonic forms or something.
Yeah, okay, Aristotle.
Yeah, right. All right. Oh, look at big shot Aristotle over here.
Plato.
Plato said it was perfect. It was perfect. So, and are the Kurds savvy at PR? Have they made mistakes? Do some people over romanticize them? Obviously, but is this an enormously positive development and an experiment in the overall grand scheme of Kurdish autonomy and rights, as well as political innovation? Obviously. I mean, that's just undeniable in terms of reality.
I mean, it's amazing when you look at history.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. So when you look at history, it's amazing in a certain sense. So, I think that it's very important at the very least now to not echo Turkish or Trump talking points about what's happening while we are literally mid-slaughter. Now, if people in the United States who were supposedly supportive of the Kurds in a genuine sense and not just as partners against ISIS, and people like Marco Rubio could care less about the slaughter or the political experiment, it goes without saying, and all of the mainline Democrats and everything else, then yes, as Mark Ames pointed out, you would have to look at supporting a broader diplomatic process, which almost certainly would involve some type of partnership with Assad, again, even as Assad is a war criminal. The reality of a lot of these situations is that agreements are going to be established between people who have blood on their hands. That's what the former South African president, Thabo Mbeki, said in 2012 at the outset. He said, the international community comes in, and let's be real, it is usually Europeans demanding an arrest of primarily Africans, but in this case, it is people rightfully saying, yes, Assad is putting down a rebellion. He's committing crimes against humanity. He runs an authoritarian regime. All of these things, by the way, are undeniable. I don't have any time for, trying to whitewash the nature of the Assad government. That's ridiculous. But he also has a serious coalition and constituency behind him. That has been endlessly proven. And some of the opposition was leftist and organic. That was crushed and smoked out, and as well as the popular uprising. And then the classic pattern, the CIA and the Gulf states end up funneling a huge amount of money to far-right Muslim groups with a agenda that certainly if you were a religious minority in Syria, you'd be terrified of, and not just of ISIS. That's also reality. So, and Mbeki's point was, when he was negotiating in back-channel negotiations to end apartheid, if the international community came in and arrested F.W. de Klerk and other apartheid leaders, would they be right? Definitionally, if you head the apartheid regime, you're guilty of multiple crimes against humanity. But Thabo was like, I can't have them go. They're my negotiating partners. This is a political process. We need to actually establish a deal here. And, similarly, in a real, actual situation, that may be the only pivot point. And that was, of course, would be blocked by the United States, because that's still U.S. policy to have this regime change effort, even under Trump, even as that actually hasn't even practically been the policy going back to 2014 and 15, when all of the military effort turned and focused on ISIS. So it's incoherent. Bottom line is that this is an act of Turkish imperialism. This is horrific on a humanitarian level, and we should have solidarity with the Rojava Kurds.